The AI Deal of Trust is a unique, fair opportunity to empower young generation about trust technology and AI opportunity. In the first chapter of this series, the AI Deal of Trust, we invite female leaders with exponential AI experience dedicated to one of the most crucial area of AI ethics, AI responsible and trust technology. Today, we fly from Seattle to California with our guest, Genevieve Smith, Associate Director of the Center for Equity, Gender and Leadership at the University of California, Berkeley. Hi, Genevieve.
Hello, nice to be here today.
How are you?
I'm doing great. I am staying cozy in my apartment while it's raining and a bit dreary outside, but nice to be working from home today.
Welcome to the show, the AI Deal of Trust. I'm very happy to have you today with us. During these discussions, and we name it the Authentic Discussion generally, we will dig in many topics around trust technology, AI ethics, diversity, risk and threats around exponential technology, and other topics. But before that, we are really curious to learn more about your academic background and your journey to end up in this incredible mission in Berkeley.
Absolutely. So, the last decade of my career, I've really been focused on advancing equity, particularly related to gender. So I actually started off with my career looking at how to make off-grid energy technologies like cleaner cooking stoves more gender inclusive. And so I worked with the UN Foundation to design and adapt cleaner burning cook stoves and other off-grid energy technologies and think about gender strategies to kind of scale these different types of technologies as well. And in my work in that off-grid energy sector, I really recognized how much power that business had to impact gender equity, and also saw at the same time increasing motivations and initiatives from larger multinational companies, everything spanning from Nike and Gap, et cetera, to support women's empowerment without necessarily knowing what that meant or how to do it well and authentically. So I went back to UC Berkeley for my master's to really delve into this, empowerment, equity, and the role of business. What does it all mean? What are the interconnections? I was fortunate to get a research position with the UN high-level panel on women's economic empowerment, where I really focused on, this is post-Berkeley, where I really focused on the role of business in advancing women's economic empowerment and also digital inclusion. And then I landed a position at the International Center for Research on Women, where I advised Fortune 500 companies and led research on topics spanning inclusive technology, bias, positive masculinity, to gender lens investing. So, really the gamut of different types of gender equity and women's empowerment, and even equity and inclusion more broadly types of issues and topics. So I did a lot of experimental design, data collection and analysis in projects largely across Africa and Asia. And in my advisory work in particular, I recognized that there was this glaring gap that those that are in leadership and senior management positions at businesses often don't value or prioritize considerations related to equity and inclusion. And, I think that there's been this focus in educational institutions and business schools where the focus is on the shareholder value, so returns for shareholders, as opposed to thinking more broadly. And that's really changing to more thinking about kind of stakeholders more broadly. But efforts around equity and inclusion have been this nice to have, kind of cushy things on the side, and often have very little resources. Maybe they're housed in the CSR or sustainability departments, HR departments as well. But I was drawn back to Berkeley and Haas School of Business, which is where the center that I work with, Center for Equity, Gender and Leadership, or EGAL for short, that's where we're housed in the business school. And I was drawn back by partly one of the defining leadership principles of Haas, which is question the status quo. And I was excited to think about how can we educate future and business leaders to really understand equity and inclusion, and to really question the status quo around business and the role of capitalism. And I'd also done some work with the founding and executive director of EGAL, Kelly McElhaney. So when the position at EGAL came up, I really couldn't pass it up.
Great. So you start speaking a little bit about the current role that you are occupying today, but let's go have more details about what consists this role, and particularly what are the main projects, if it's not confidential for sure, that you can share with us in order to have a concrete example for the young people.
Yeah, absolutely. So as associate director at EGAL, I'm on the leadership team, and I direct and execute on strategy to advance equity and inclusion in business. And a primary mechanism for this is through what we call playbooks, which are resources that translate academic research and understanding into practitioner strategies and tools. So a lot of times, there's this incredible research that academics write and develop, and it can often sit within journals or, in this kind of ivory tower of academia without necessarily being made actionable and being put into practice to see the change come to life. So that's really what our playbooks focus on, is how can we take this rich body of knowledge and understanding and literature and make it action-oriented and actually have practitioners put it into practice. And within this, a focus of mine is around mitigating bias in artificial intelligence and advancing inclusive AI. So we launched a playbook on this topic last summer and have done a series of different events bringing together industry leaders, academics, and MBA students on the topic of inclusive AI and how business school education must adapt. So how do we prepare business school students? Thinking about equitable and inclusive AI isn't just something for engineers or data scientists. It's for project managers. It's for business leaders. It's for people in the C-suite. It's really spans across the organization, and we can talk more about that. But we wanted to make sure that was really, we're wanting to make sure that's a conversation that's being had. And relatedly, I can tell you about one of my other current primary projects, which is a partnership we're doing with Google. Excuse me, to understand how language. Thank you. Something in my throat. To understand how language can drive equity and inclusion. So specifically, the research looks at how does the language that we use matter? How does what we say matters? How can this advance racial bias and inequities? But importantly, how can we actually advance racial equity and inclusion through the things we say and how we communicate? So we're not just looking, though, at how humans communicate. We're also looking at how machines communicate in artificial intelligence. So what does AI, how does AI learn about human language and use human language, and where could issues come into play there, and what are opportunities? So we'll be developing a playbook on that topic as well, with actionable tools on language for advancing racial equity and inclusion. And then just quickly, I'll mention some other things that I do in my position. So I also develop strategies and provide support to advance understandings around equity and inclusion on campus among future generations of business leaders here at Haas. So I write and publish case studies, which are a primary teaching tool that's used in management education. And I'll be starting one soon on the topic of equitable and inclusive AI. And this is a way to really get that understanding into the classroom as well, right? Get people to talk about these issues within management education. And the thing is that most existing published case studies that are used in business schools, and case studies, so just to give you a sense of how valuable they are in management education programs, at Harvard, they estimate 80% of learning comes from case studies at the Harvard management program, so MBA program. So that's a massive amount of the learning that takes place. Right. But most of these case studies are primarily about white male protagonists, and they neglect to address topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that are absolutely critical for new business leaders to be able to navigate. And the thing is, this lack of diversity in case studies, it perpetuates the status quo that traditional business leaders are both male and white. So we support professors to increase diversity, equity, inclusion in cases. We write cases to fill some of the different gaps that exist. And we also just 2 days ago, on the January 26th, we launched a professor pledge, which is mobilizing commitments from professors at business schools globally to advance case studies with diverse protagonists and cases on diversity, equity, inclusion topics. So those are just a smattering of some things that we're working on.
And we have exclusive news as well about this last project that you launched 2 days ago. My question is, as I said every time in our podcast and show, we have a lot of spontaneous questions. So one of the spontaneous questions that has come to my mind is how the students perceive this work, and particularly this fight, because it's not only a work, but there's a fight in order to achieve this equity, right, in businesses, but not only in businesses, but also in society, right? What's their perception today?
Yeah, well, I will say that Haas is a very it's a leading business school, and it has the students are incredibly sharp, incredibly proactive. Many of them really care about issues in our society more broadly, and are also really committed to making sure that our environment at Haas is equitable and inclusive as well. I think there is generally a sense that that things need to change, and that not among all students, of course, not speaking for all students necessarily, but a lot of what I'm hearing is that there's a recognition that the way that capitalism has been structured is not working for everyone, right? And something needs to essentially, be fixed. And also that there's a lot of issues within the workplace that have been really sticky. I think when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace as well, there is a bit of frustration around something called performative allyship. People perhaps putting on a front of being an ally, but not really doing the work to address things like systemic racism and racism that can manifest in our workplace, but also in other aspects of the business and business model. So there's definitely a sense of like, how can we think about what does it really take? How can we move beyond talking about these things to actually address these issues? And how can we also think about the ways that different industries impact equity and inclusion? I was actually just participating in a speaker session last night with students, and I get so much inspiration from them, but the way they've approached the speaker series is looking at how do different industries, what are they grappling with when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And the session next week is actually on tech, and looking at, both issues of diversity, equity, inclusion within the tech industry itself, and then issues within tech products, like bias and AI and things like that. So, these conversations are happening. Business school students are interested in these things. I think there's a, recognition that things really need to shift, and the U.S. has had, a real confrontation with itself this last year and still going on.
True.
And there's just a really big understanding that now is the time that we need to really make concrete and actionable changes.
And I'm asking this question because I'm going through the challenges of this mission. Now we talk about the positive side and all the great work. What are the main challenges that you face with your team when you address this topic, which is something that we fight for many years, probably many decades, and probably according to some study, we need to wait, or we must wait for hundreds of years, which is intolerable for me, right? So what are the challenges today?
Yeah, I think that at a really high level, one of the big challenges is that there's been this push of, like I was mentioning before, focusing on returns to shareholders, right? Being the purpose of business. And I think there's a shift from shareholder capitalism to more stakeholder capitalism. And I think it's a good thing. A challenge is that we've been, really embedded within the shareholder capitalism perspective. And now we're starting to shift a little bit more. And it's just, it's an interesting time for sure. I think another kind of main challenge is that we need to push ourselves beyond thinking about only diversity and what comes across a lot of times and just like, do we have, how many numbers do we have? You know, what's like the representation numbers of particular identities or groups. And we really need to be focused on creating more equitable and inclusive outcomes and opportunities. And that includes, you know, even on campus as well, that includes at Haas, like in our work that we do with students, you know, not just focusing on diversity among students, but really focusing on the equity and inclusion parts. And that's a challenge I think that a lot of businesses more broadly face too, because there's such a focus on the hiring and the recruitment part, as opposed to, you know, we need more of the focus on what happens when diverse folks get into those environments as well. And I think there's been less effort there that needs to be really doubled down on. And then I think, you know, making sure that current business leaders are able to access and use resources that help them make this shift. I think we really that's a challenge that we face, is making sure that they really are accessible to current business leaders and meeting them where they're at. And I think people are at different levels, and so that can be challenging.
But I'm not sure, but I guess that because we many times during my career, we have a lot of discussion about this, because not only we are concerned, but also because it's a reality and we need to work on it. But when you talk with some business leaders, probably there's a big work to make them understand. And that's why your work is, and the work of your team is helping to propose this framework of understanding and how to understand and why you have to understand this part. But is it something that it brings some frustration in some cases? Like some ones, without making generalizations, not everyone, but some ones will not understand even with all the material that you can propose for them, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's definitely a challenge. And, you know, business leaders, they have a lot going on. There's a lot of different pieces happening. Sure. And I think one of the big challenges is, how do you convey something in a way that's really clear and concise, so they don't necessarily need the, you know, technical background for, correct, but also in a way that does service to the particular topic. Like, what is enough information to share with them to know about a topic like bias in AI without being too much that will inundate them and perhaps not allow them to, you know, even access those resources. And I think that's a kind of a constant give and pull, you know, is how to reach them in a way that's really accessible and easy to understand, right? True. So we're continuing to ask ourselves, how can we make, when it comes to our resources with current business leaders in particular, how can we make these really easy and rewarding to use? What are the different ways to make it easy and rewarding? We're always asking ourselves that. And also we do a lot of piloting with business leaders in developing these different tools and prototypes of the different tools. And so using that kind of design thinking approach is really important as well, to make sure that it's grounded in their needs and desires.
Great. So let's move to another topic, which is name it trust technology. And it's one of the main topics in this show. So from your great experience, how can we build transparent and trust technology today?
Yeah, well, from the trust piece is so critical, right? I mean, you know, when we talk about like businesses working to deploy AI at scale, it's necessary to trust the technology. And you know, I was reading about I think there was a survey recently by IBM that was finding that 78% of respondents to their survey globally say it's very critically important that they can trust their AI's output is fair, safe, and reliable. So, I mean, trust is massive, right? And addressing bias, when it comes to like, how do we do this and how do we build it? Addressing bias, I think, is a precursor to establishing the trust. So it's a place that we really need to start. And also being honest about what's possible to address versus what's not possible. I think that's another key piece about building trust. You know, one thing that I hear a lot is, and this myth is, that technology can be de-biased or unbiased. it kind of implies that technology can remove bias from technology 100%. And I think if we're being really honest about what is and isn't possible, it's not possible to debias something 100%. And we'll go more into this when we talk about the bias and AI map, and I'll share more about this. But it's really critical to be honest about this, and which is exactly where the transparency piece comes into play too, right? They're so closely linked. And transparency alongside being able to explain an AI model is just absolutely necessary, both internally. So you have to be able to explain it to yourself and your colleagues and the business leaders, whoever's building the technology, but externally as well, especially if for folks that might be using the technology or, they need to understand how it was made and be able to explain it too. So I think especially when something, when algorithms are produced and perhaps an unattended consequence comes out or an undesirable one, the inevitable question is, how did this happen? And the teams that are developing AI systems really should be able to explain why and how their AI system arrived at a particular decision and be able to reference information and training data and algorithms that informed it. I think one of the challenges is that a lot of times there might be siloed teams that are working on an AI system, and AI systems that use machine learning, which was our focus of our playbook, they're often these kind of models that are considered black box, where it's difficult or even impossible for developers to know why the machine learning system made a particular decision or prediction. So it's really important when it comes to transparency to document what goes into that AI and ML system. So, what's the data that was used? What are the proxies? What are the guiding frameworks for how decisions were made? And that can also help enhance communication between teams internally, and, including with non-technical staff as well. And then from an external perspective, like being transparent about the model is not realistic or sensible in some cases. There can be privacy or exploitation concerns, so you don't necessarily want to be totally transparent with the model externally. And that also can result in like bad actors that use the AI system or exploit it. But that said, it's still important to have a certain level of transparency and being able to explain explainability for users and those end targets whose lives are going to be impacted by these different systems. So we really like things like data sheets for data sets, which can help track information on how the data set was created, what went into it, for example. And there's some other different tools as well to kind of increase the transparency piece, but that's just one of them.
My point, as you said, it's very crucial to be to prove the part trust and transparent of a technology, and especially of an AI implementation or a product. For many reasons, you explain many reasons within what your answer, but because technology is not only a tool, it's a tool that will be used by people for many purposes. So it depends of the purpose, it depends of the target, it depends of the business, it depends of the user, it depends of a lot of stuff, and it depends of the science that you put on it, right? So people are right now, I think, are more focusing on the people who are building those products. And I think it's not, they are not the only responsible, because they are executing some part. For sure, they are so valuable in the process, right? Because they're bringing this intelligence and creating this machine that bring a value. But at the end of the day, it's for business, right? And the business, they are the owner at the end. They are the owner of the data, they are the owner of the process, and they are the owner of the product. So they need to understand and be aware about this part of trust technology. And why we talk about trust technology, because when we define the vision of AI exponential thinker, we know that there's AI ethics, AI responsible and trustworthy technology. And we said, okay, let's go by the short one. We talk about trust technology, frankly. Why? Because it's not about AI ethics only. It's about many other aspects around. That's why we put trust in front of technology, because people are probably trusting, some people, lot of people in the world are trusting technology without knowing what's behind the scene. And that's why we
Totally.
talk about, we are here to empower about trust technology, not about technology. Because there is technology, but there is trust technology. And trust technology is, like you said, such a crucial topics to be sure.
Yeah.
And to be sure as well that there is not any bias. I'm not sure that it exists in the world. I
Yeah.
spent 2 decades in this world of AI, so I know that you need to be, like you said, honest about if there is some bias, be sure about it and clarify the bias. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's
Mm-hmm.
very important for the user or for the business or for the stakeholder, shareholder, whatever, to know about it. Otherwise, there is no sense. But it's really hard topic when we address it in the business. It's a really hard topic because every time we focus on the people who are building, but the point is
Mm-hmm.
not on building only, it's about all the other ones around, and for sure the society. So I like
Yeah.
what you said about being honest, and the fact also that being 100% unbiased, I'm not sure that it exists for one
Mm-hmm.
reason, because we are human, and there is no one
Exactly.
human who has no bias in his life. Sometimes we have a question, and
Right.
probably we have it today with you at the end, and we know when we ask the question there is a bias. But every time I say there is a bias in this question, but I'm aware about it. So take it from
Yeah.
it, right? So let's,
Yeah. And
yeah,
just one quick thing I think on that, I think that's it's so true. And there is a sense too that, you know, people trust in, I think generally people think that technology is objective and neutral, right? We think that, oh, the technology gave us something that must be objective and neutral. And we increasingly are realizing that it's not, right? There's all these examples around how it's not. And I think that that's actually a really important piece of the trust technologies as well, is recognizing that, this belief that technology is objective and neutral is not true. And we need to both acknowledge that ourselves, and then to build trust in these technologies, we need to have honesty, like I was mentioning before, around the different kind of components around technology, and what are the limitations, what are the areas that, how is this information informed this particular technology, because the blind trust in technology is going away, right? And so now for this next stage of technology, that transparency, I think, will be absolutely critical, because nobody's under the impression, or many people are no longer under the impression, that technology is this objective or neutral thing anymore. So to get that trust is going to take more transparency and honesty. And ultimately for the business, I mean, it is risky. It is a big risk to not have technology that is built to be able to be trusted and be responsible.
correct.
From a reputational standpoint, from various types of standpoints. And we go into some of the business implications in our playbook as well. But this is something that business leaders are going to care about, not just because it's the right thing to care about, but because this is a big deal for businesses.
You're right. I'm so excited to go to the next topic about the playbook that you work on, and name it mitigating bias in artificial intelligence. It's such amazing work. So you led the development of a playbook for business leaders who build and use AI to unlock value responsibly and equitably. This playbook translates academic research into practitioner-oriented strategy. This is what we understood right now. So let's have an overview of this relevant material. So what you have to say about this material, that we found that there is a very genius way that you propose it to help the people to understand, and the business owner to understand. And my other question, very quick, it's I know that it's for business owners, but what about the other ones? Is it for AI engineers? Is it for students also?
Yeah, absolutely. So the playbook, as you mentioned, it helps business leaders and other folks in the business understand, one, why bias exists in AI systems. Two, what are the impacts of that bias, both on individuals, on society, and on the business itself. And then three, what are challenges to address bias? So what are kind of the sticky issues? And then lastly, we outlined 7 different plays that should be put in place to mitigate the bias. And those plays are in three different strategy buckets. The first is around teams, because as you mentioned before, who develops these AI systems matters. It matters who's involved, and it matters who's not involved, and the culture that is among those teams and organizations that are developing those systems as well. So the first two buckets really focus on diversity among teams that are creating AI systems, as well as a culture of responsibility and ethics within those teams themselves and the organizations. The second bucket is really focused on the AI model. And the AI model, so this is more kind of the technical pieces, but how does bias come up within, or what are the actions that can be taken to develop responsible data sets that can help train algorithms and be used in the validation of those algorithms? And then what are also ways to develop responsible algorithms themselves? So looking at kind of proxies and variables and things like that. So it's a little bit more technical. So that one's more focused on folks that are really developing algorithms and AI systems themselves. And then the third bucket is on the corporate governance and leadership.
Oh my
and
God.
This, sorry?
But, oh my God.
Yeah, lots there. But, you know, we really wanted to make sure we had included and highlighted these, because I think when you read about bias in AI and different solutions and, you know, research online, most of it is on the AI model, right? Most of it is on how do we mitigate that bias from a technical perspective, and how do we interpret that bias from a technical perspective. But that's, you know, that's not the limits of bias, right? Corporate governance and leadership plays a really important role in how these different systems are developed. And so in those particular, in that strategy, we have one around what are the responsible AI governance mechanisms? So things like developing AI ethics leads, and what are the kind of policies that you should have across from a governance perspective. And then we also look at what are ways that you can engage other aspects of the business to support responsible and ethical AI, like CSR teams. There's roles for CSR teams in helping advance this as well. And then the last one is using voice and influence to advance industry change and regulations for responsible AI. You know, we can't ignore that there are regulations that are needed. You know, that's really, really important. And business leaders do have a role to play in helping have those conversations and helping inform some aspects of, you know, those regulations that are led by government. So it's really designed for business leaders, you know, spanning the C-suite, CEO, board members, ethics leaders, engineers, product managers. So business leaders in like a larger perspective, yeah. Right? Not just like business leader in terms of like who is the person that owns this business or the CEO. And then we have, you know, the particular plays in our playbook. Those vary based on the audience. So like I said, the AI model, that's going to be really technical. So that's more focused on, you know, folks involved in those technical pieces. But the, you know, the corporate governance ones, those are very focused on the board, on the C-suite, on, you know, AI ethics leads and things like that. So the playbook itself is for a wide variety of folks, and the plays themselves, in fact, we put in the plays who are the players involved in each of these plays. So each play outlines that.
One of my it resonates too much. That's why I'm laughing at the same time. I'm seeing my life, my journey. That's why I'm laughing in some parts, because there's a lot of you know, it resonates. Nice. This is the right word. My point now, it's between the three parts, what are the one that it took more like effort, let's say effort, to design today, not to convince,
yeah,
to design.
I think and maybe I'll start with what one was a little bit easier to, as I, you know, process and think about the hardest one. You know, I think like the most obvious thing is thinking about diversity among teams, right? As you mentioned before, AI systems are human creation, so they need to be created by humans that represent different lived experiences and identities.
Okay.
And we know a lot already about what it takes to create diversity, equity, inclusion among teams. And so that one was a little bit it was a little easier in a lot of ways.
Okay.
I think the one that took probably more time, one of the challenges, and perhaps this also is a reason it took more time, is that there's so much research that's coming out right now and pretty consistently around things like responsible data set development and responsible algorithm development. And so we would be writing these plays and then having to also, this new research paper just came out this week on this one, we were constantly having to add new research and literature as we were going, which made it a little bit challenging. And I think that I would say the corporate governance and leadership stuff was actually not as challenging. The play too around the kind of promoting a culture of ethics and responsibility related to AI, I think that one was kind of tricky. And the reason that I say that is because I don't think that it's being done well right now. And it's really around, this one is really around, like, what does it take to, and a lot of times companies are very focused on, speed to market. You have to get the product out, and that matters to the business, right? You want to be the first to market. That's really important. But that is fundamentally at odds with ethical considerations a lot of times, which require, well, let's slow down, let's think about this, let's reflect on, why this might have happened. Those are at odds. And so employees might flag something that could be an ethical consideration, and they could get dinged for that. They could get by essentially getting in the way of being that, being first to market, being efficient. There's just a fundamental tension there. And I think that's what made this play really hard, is because we had to think about, and I think it's been, kind of explored less of what does it create? How can we create a culture that really prioritizes that ethical consideration, that responsibility, and grapples with that, where there's also the very real business constraints and business considerations. And so, I think a big piece here is we need to update how we value performance, right? Like right now in performance reviews, there isn't a metric or goal around like ethical consideration, especially for people that are working on AI systems. What about including something, a performance metric around responsibility and ethics within developing AI systems and developing objective and key results, OKRs, and key performance indicators that actually map to mitigating bias and developing responsible and ethical AI. Those aren't really exist right now. And I think that's super important. So that one, this play was more challenging because we had to really think, how do we deal with this tension, this real tension that exists? And we didn't have a lot of, examples to follow of people that are maybe doing all of these different things really well. So what are the creative ways that we can actually tackle this? So I had a lot of fun with this play, but it was definitely more challenging.
I'm just thinking about all the discussion that you had once you have to face those challenges and during the time of design of this part, because it's quite it's really we need to think about the belief of the person. I think we need to take the belief and to try to show the people that it's very important to care about the AI ethics, and especially the part of trust around technology, because if it's not hurting now, it will hurt someday, right? So don't push it away, because it will come back. But once it comes back,